Hey, what's up guys? Thanks for tuning in. This is another basics or fundamentals video. And this time the fundamentals video is going to be on the fundamentals of a profile. If you've dove into the execution guide or any of the actual workout videos in phase one, you're going to see that I use the terminology profile sometimes. And what I want to do is just draw a little bit of clarity on that topic. This is something that can be overwhelming because we're talking about muscular anatomy, we're talking about physiology, and we're talking about physics. So this is like going back to school. And I don't want to confuse you guys too much. I just want to give you guys enough to where you can apply it. And then also if you go back and you review those exercise guide videos, it's like, okay, that makes sense. So when we're talking about a profile, we're talking about the muscle's ability to create force at a certain part in its muscle length. It's either the shortened range, the mid-range, or the lengthened part of that muscle length, okay? Right out of the gate, I want to eliminate any confusion about what that means. So we're talking about the actual length of a muscle and its ability to produce force, power, and internal tension. We're not talking about an exercise. Exercises also have a shortened range, a lengthened range, and a mid-range. But it doesn't necessarily mean that a muscle is fully shortened or fully lengthened or in its middle range. It could never get to the fully shortened position or vice versa, depending on what application you choose. And to give you guys a little bit of clarity, I'll use the leg extension as an example. Leg extension has a bottom, which is a lengthened position, and it has a top, which is a shortened position. But as it relates to the quads, the only thing that it does is it actually trains the quads in their fully shortened position with resistance. So it gives the quads an opportunity to exercise producing force more so in their shortened range than anything. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have a hack squat. And a hack squat trains the quads in a lengthened position for the most part, the opposite of the leg extension. But it doesn't really train them in a fully shortened position. So the quads are getting lengthened, but they're not getting fully shortened, okay? So within an exercise, when we talk about profiles, what we're doing is trying to have an idea of where that exercise is hardest from a resistance standpoint and where my body has the greatest opportunity with that resistance to produce force. When we're talking about a strength profile, we're talking about an understanding of what can I expect based off of an exercise selection, knowing what happens to my muscle when I choose this application. And that is what this line graph is for, okay? So this line graph basically is a muscle length. So imagine I took my bicep out of my body and I put it between two fixed points. Here's my origin, here's my insertion, and then I'm creating as much tension as I possibly can. Either that muscle's fully lengthened, it's kind of in the middle, or it's fully shortened. And how much power or how much force can it produce? That's what this line graph is identifying. Again, this is just a rough sketch. So let's just say, for example's sake, the bottom of this sidebar here is 0 pounds of force that it can produce, and the top is 100 pounds of force that that muscle can produce. At the bottom here, we have the muscle length. So what you're seeing here is this point right here is the muscle in its shortened position. This point here is the muscle in its lengthened position or middle position. And this point here is its muscle in its lengthened position. And to give you guys a little bit of a visual demonstration, the shortened position for my bicep would be here, its middle range would be here, and its lengthened position would be here. What can I expect to get from a force production or tension production standpoint when I'm in these different muscle length ranges of motion? Well, in the shortened range, you can see that your ability to produce force and power is pretty stinking low. Also, your drop off is going to be very fast. In the middle range, you can see your force production is very, very high. It's because that muscle is in a very safe position. It's not in any extreme, so your body identifies that as a safe place to load and train. And then the lengthened position, okay, if I softly go here, you can see it's not as weak as the shortened position, but in most cases, with most muscles, it's still not very strong to produce force. So now you have a little bit of an understanding of, based off of this bell curve, that's what we call, okay, if I go in and I choose a preacher curl and I work that shortened range of motion for the biceps, I may not be quite as strong as a incline, lying dumbbell curl, and I may not be quite as strong as a standing dumbbell curl when I make that selection. My standing dumbbell curl could be the place where I load the most. So the thing that's important to understand about why this graph is something that you need to have a little bit of understanding about is so that you can have a little bit of a concept or a grasp on how much can you load an exercise, or what can your expectation be for progressing an exercise. In my opinion, exercises that kind of highlight the middle of the range, you're going to be able to progress from a load standpoint probably a whole lot faster, especially if you're a newbie. Things in the shortened range, okay, you may be able to progress quickly, but they're going to drop off much faster because your opportunity to load that muscle in that range of motion is not really that great. And in the lengthened range, okay, it's kind of like in the middle. You may be able to load that muscle there, but again, your progress may be a little bit slower in comparison to the middle of the range. And that changes from muscle to muscle to muscle. Well, hopefully you're starting to get an understanding of why knowing a little bit about this expectation of a strength profile is important, because you know what to expect when you actually choose an exercise selection. Okay? Now, a profile as it pertains to an exercise that I've already figured out what the strength profile for a muscle is. Okay? So a profile for an exercise and a profile for a muscle is different. We know that this length of position for this bicep is like not quite as strong as this position. And definitely this is the weakest part of the range of motion for the bicep, the fully shortened position. However, if I go into the cable and I get myself into like a drag cable curl, I can manipulate that profile to be hardest where my biceps are actually able to produce their most force as it pertains to you, where they're most strong. So where are they most strong? They're strongest in the middle of their range of motion, okay? So what I would do is I'd make a cable setting literally that makes a 90-degree angle with my wrist at the middle of elbow flexion. So even though I'm in this fully lengthened position, as I go through my curl, a nice match profile that's going to have equal effort would be a profile where it makes 90 degrees in the middle of this elbow flexion, and it's less than 90 degrees here, and it's greater than 90 degrees there. Hopefully that's making a little bit of sense. And the reason why, if I'm able to produce more force here in the mid-range, that means that I can do more weight here. If I'm not able to produce very much force here, I'm going to do less weight here. And if I'm not able to produce as much force here, it means I'm going to do less weight here. So if I'm able to make a manipulation to the setup of my exercises, where let's say that this cable setup that I did in the drag curl starts at 40 pounds in the short, well, I'm going to go backwards. It starts at 60 pounds in the lengthened position. It goes to 100 pounds in the mid-range, and then it drops off to 40 pounds in the shortened range. Well, what I'm doing is I'm matching my body's ability to produce force, but I'm also making it have equal effort throughout the entire range of motion. And that's what we call balancing out a profile for an exercise. So this is your muscles profile, and you can see that its ability to produce force is imbalanced. But if I manipulate what parts of the range of motion are easier and what parts are hard from a resistance standpoint with accessories and cables and good machines, things of that nature, accommodating resistance like bands and chains, it allows me to take this bell curve. I'm going to come in here with a purple marker, and what I essentially did, if this was another line graph down here, I took that bell curve and I flattened it out. So no longer is it this, now it's this. I'm producing as much force as I possibly can in the shortened range, as much as I can in the middle range, and as much as I can in the lengthened range. That making sense? One last example, that reverse hack squat, okay? Well, the hack squat. A really common thing to use is a reverse band, right? Or a band. Now, it doesn't matter if you band from the bottom or you reverse band from the top. It's doing the same thing to the profile for that exercise. If I'm going to throw a band on there, again, my goal is to do what's called flattening out that profile, making that profile a straight line. I don't want my profile for that muscle anymore, that working muscle, the quads in this case, to be a bell curve. I want them to be working equally in all ranges of that exercise throughout the entire range, okay? So if I apply a band, before applying that band, I need to have an understanding that that lengthened position, so if this is the bottom of a hack, so this is a hack squat. That making sense, guys? Here's your back pad, here's your platform, here's where the plate's usually loaded, right? There's your plate there, and here's your body. Making sense? Kind of. This is your knee flexion, okay? In the bottom of that hack squat, that's where this weight is most loaded. So let's say 100 pounds. In the top, it's at 0. So in the shortened range, I'm getting like no loading because my joints are stacking. What we call this is an ascending profile, meaning the more that my joints go more and more to a stacked position and my femur begins to get under my hips and in line with my ankles, okay, I'm producing less and less force with my quads. We'd like to have maximal force production, maximal tension throughout the entire range of motion. So maybe in this regular traditional hack squat, I'm only working like 20% at maximal force production. Now, if I came in here, this is my fancy little band. I put a band on there, okay? And I have a reverse banding process going on now. If I go in there, this reverse band is going to stretch, right? It's going to start to stretch and create more tension on the way down. And let's say that still equals that 100 pounds of force production in the bottom. Now as that band deloads, I've made my adjustment with the amount of plates that I have on here, that as the band goes up and it becomes less and less stretched as I go to the top, rather than the weight going from 100 to 0, it stays at about 100 the entire time, forcing the quads to work equally throughout that entire range of motion. Is that making sense? All right. So the band deloads, and what was 100 pounds in the bottom starts to become more of 100 pounds of weight load as it goes to the top. So on the way down, we're relying on the band to accommodate, and on the way up, we're relying on the plates to accommodate, if that makes sense. It's just this buddy-buddy process going back and forth. But regardless of the setup, what you have is a full band load in the bottom and a full band deload. And that's the reason why I like to be aggressive with the bands that I use. I don't use little skinny bands. I use very, very thick bands, because you have a big muscle in the quads and you have them able and capable to produce a lot of force in that stretched position. So we want to make sure that they're also producing a lot of force in that middle position and that top position by being able to add more load to that hack squat machine. Okay, so let's kind of reel this guy back in, because I did go on a little bit of a tangent. What you have in all scenarios is that your strength profile for a muscle is dictating or showing in a bell curve its ability to produce force at various muscle lengths. And why that's really good for you is it's going to give you an understanding of, if I choose this application, what can I expect to do from a loading standpoint, and how can I expect, what my expectations for actually progressing that load long term. Outside of that, strength profile is identifying the muscle, what's happening with the muscle, but an exercise profile is identifying where the hardest part of the exercise is. The hack squat in the bottom, okay, that's your example there. The cable curl that I set up, that position where it makes a 90-degree angle in the mid-range, is equal output. So I identify the hardest part. In some applications, like a lot of your presses and a lot of your squats, you're able to use things like accommodating resistance, or certain machines like prime and strive machines, some Cybex pieces, to do what's called flattening out that profile. So you take that muscle profile that was that bell curve and you make it flat. And what that means, how it applies, is that you have equal output throughout the entire range of motion. Why is that important? You guys know yet? I haven't talked about this. Why that is important is, if I have a hack squat and I'm only working maximal force production for 20% of that range of motion, then I throw a reverse band on, and now I'm working maximal force production for 90% of that range of motion. And I do 3 sets of 5 with that. Which one is a higher volume. That is. So for those people out there that you see that are doing less sets in their program, it's because they're probably putting a little bit more thought process into the actual exercise applications and setups than you may be at that point in time. So even though you're doing more stuff on paper, you're working at a lower intensity throughout the entire range of motion from rep to rep, from set to set than they are, okay? So more force production, more intensity means more of this, adaptation. And more adaptation means more of this, if that's your goal. Or it means more of this, if that's your goal. Or it means more of this, if that's your goal. So more adaptation means more muscle, means more recomp, means more output. And when it comes to training efficiently, that's the name of the game. And for me, the main reason is not because I'm trying to always make things harder. I love making exercises harder, and definitely not because I'm trying to make this setup more confusing, but just because I'm trying to spend less time in the gym per session. If I'm able to keep force production at 100% or close to it for 45 minutes, that's a heck of a lot better workout regimen than if I'm going in and doing 2 hours where my force production on average is 20% the entire time. Okay, so something to consider. That is the fundamentals of a muscle profile and also a movement or exercise profile. They kind of are the same. They're very, very different in a sense too. And so hopefully you have a little bit of clarity now on what each individual thing is. And it gives you a little bit of understanding of when I say profile, how you can apply that and what I'm actually talking about. Okay, thanks for tuning in, guys.